Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about what is technically album number 15 from Tangerine Dream, Green Desert. Okay, we're getting into the home stretch for this series. Only one more album left in their catalog after this one that I plan to do a dedicated review video on. Though now we're getting into an interesting little one-off point in their catalog, one that I did get a few people confused as to why I wasn't covering it earlier. Depending on who you ask, this project marks as either album number 15 in their catalog, or album number 4.5. This album was released in 1986, but it was originally recorded and shelved in 1973, in between their Atom and Phaedra albums. In my Phaedra review, I alluded to the existence of this unreleased demo tape which TD sent to Virgin Records and upon hearing convinced Richard Branson to sign them, kicking off the entire peak period era for the band that would follow. And Green Desert was that very demo tape, conceived at a specific point when Peter Baumann was technically still in the band but did not contribute thanks to his touring Nepal and India at the time, and is thereby the brainchild of Edgar Froese and Christopher Franke alone. Fast forward to the mid-80s at another brief point when the band was in fact left to just those two alone, Johannes Schmoling having just broken off the band, and they thought, what the hell, let's pull up that old demo tape, remix it, and finally release it to the public. Opinions on the results nowadays seem to be maybe a bit all over the place. Some love it, and some weren't really all that enthusiastic thanks to the production not sounding at all like it was recorded in 1973. In fact, I've seen a bit of a running conspiracy theory among certain fans that the tagline of this album having been recorded in 1973 is just a flat-out lie, meant to gather more interest in selling certain box sets the album was originally released as a part of a package with. Truth be told, if you do listen to this album, the actual sound of it, the synth settings and even the guitar work definitely sounds way closer to something like Hyperborea than it does to Atom or Phaedra. And oh, they say they recorded it during a time when Peter Baumann just happened to be unavailable. Convenient much, insert tinfoil hat here. Granted, I don't personally subscribe to that theory. That seems like a really pointless thing to lie about. Like, if that weren't true, then why would they even need to say that? Lay Park may not have been a good album, but surely it didn't completely evaporate the entire decade and a half of goodwill they built up overnight, where lying to draw more interest would even be necessary. If they wanted to lie, I feel like if they had advertised this album as completely brand new material for 1986, then it might have actually been received and remembered better than it was, acting as an effective bounce back and course correction from the flopped sellout move of Lay Park that returned them to their roots and delivered more of the kind of thing that their core fans actually wanted from them at the time. Like, it's definitely not hard to believe that the vast majority of what you hear on this album was recorded in the mid-80s. Like, they just re-recorded the entire thing from the ground up with their more up-to-date and actually reliable synth equipment. But these tracks having been originally composed in 1973 also tracks to me. The music on this album does in fact feel like a logical bridge between the more experimental prog-leaning sounds and structures that Atom focused on, and a precursor to the more sequencer and melody-driven approach to Phaedra. Franke's drumming in particular sounds a lot closer to the kind of thing they were doing in that early 70s era instead of what they were doing in the mid-80s when it released. And if there's anything that was probably kept from the 70s master tapes, it was probably that. Comparing the style of this album to the style of Lay Park and the albums that would release after this one, it would definitely come off as like this weird, slightly out-of-place one-off outlier and not like something that sounds like a natural continuation of this specific era. Now, putting aside all conversations of recording and producing dates and whatever, that still leaves the question of how much I actually enjoy this album and what I think of the actual music. I think it's good. I don't think it's as good as either Phaedra or Atom. There is a bit of a simplistic and rudimentary quality to these compositions that makes me feel like if we ever got to hear the 1973 demo tape in its original form, it'd probably sound kind of underwhelming and pale in comparison to the depth of the albums it bridges the gap between. I think remixing and modernizing the sound to update it for their 1986 audience may have actually been the right call for once. But completely ignoring all the backstory behind this release and taking it purely for what it is, Green Desert is still a solid album with the ability to perfectly stand on its own. I happily had it on in rotation in high school right alongside stuff like Hyperborea and Tangerine without really thinking much of it. And coming back to hear it now, I mean, it's nothing revolutionary, but it still all holds up by my ears. The main attraction here is definitely the near 20-minute title track. The way this track evolves from the first 5 minutes of all these foreboding bassy pads and sequencer effects, once again doing a good job of evoking the desert atmosphere, but with some more presently dramatic stakes, moving into fading into some arpeggiated synth chords, some 70s prog drumming from Franca, and a particularly chunky 80s guitar solo from Fruza, fading in synth choirs that have a definite resemblance to the similar mellotron-driven sounds that you'd hear on Atem and Phaedra, and the drumming picking up a lot more energy and a more crisp and clear sound around the halfway point, taking up most of the focus from there until around the 15-16 minute mark, where all the other elements fall away to lonely droning pad chords that I have to imagine were played on regular mellotrons in the original tape, not unlike something like Mysterious Semblance at the Strand of Nightmares, but instead being repurposed through cleaner synth pads that sound closer to the likes of Jean-Michel Jarre's Oxygen, with synth imitation wind sound effects to boot. A worthy side-along epic to go alongside their other classic side-along epics. The second side, meanwhile, delivers pretty much more of the exact same kind of thing, but staggered over 3 tracks. You got White Clouds, which melodically sounds like it's picking up immediately from where the title track left off. Also, despite Franca's clearly 70s style drumming being more present here than any other track, the synths on top feel more 80s than any other track as well, and the melodies do weirdly have like a little more of that TV film score edge to them, which puts it much stylistically closer to something they were doing in the Johannes Schmolling era. And I guess these feelings cancel out to the track sounding like an updated version of something you'd hear on Stratosphere, I don't know. Still neat in any case. Astral Voyager, meanwhile, is definitely the track here that sounds the most like it fit cleanly within the Phaedra era. The bass arpeggio driving that track and the lack of percussion definitely feels like it'd feel at home on that album. Even if the more cinematic style of the pads on top and the whistly tone of some of the melodies has more of that, like, 80s texture to it, still does a good job of recreating that spacey vibe of those old pioneering classics. And finally, the album is a pretty fittingly dramatic finish with Indian Summer. A much sparser arrangement with these icy chord stabs punctuating a very lonely sounding mix of Oxygen-style synth imitation wind effects and cinematic high-pitched synth strings. All these tracks admittedly flow together well enough where these last 3 tracks could reasonably present it as all being one track, and the album being presented a la Rubicon. And all of that does mean that Green Desert is one of their same-year albums in my eyes, but, you know, they still did a good job of keeping my attention pretty consistently through that whole running time. I'm not going to tell you that Green Desert is like an absolute must-listen on par with either the classics from this era which they didn't shelve, or the classics from the era right before they actually released it. But it's another solid addition to their catalog and one I've maintained good memories with. I may think Atem is better for feeling more out of the box and going a bit deeper with its sounds, but I enjoy this on roughly a comparable level to that project. It's a good album and definitely worth hearing for anyone who's just looking for more quality Tangerine Dream material. So, yeah, I'm overall feeling a 7.3 out of 10 on it. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list? Link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.